I'm the director of the Technology, Media, and Communications Specialization, Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. And this is our first partnership with someone whose program has as long a name as mine. So I'm very excited about that. Taylor Owen is here from the Center for Media, Technology, and Democracy at the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University in Canada. And this is our first webinar to launch the report written with several of our students, Hannah Clifford, Alan McInerney, Kylie Tumiati, and I'm sure there was somebody else, Leah Alaraj, Mark Cohen, which was funded by the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. And this is our first webinar to launch this report. And the idea of the report was really to look at last year and solutions that have emerged around the world to help support journalism. And our panelists are all deeply engaged in this subject. Steve Waldman has been a sort of one-man band recently, putting together so many interesting proposals and pieces of legislation. Julia Cagé, who's an economist from Sciences Po, has been working, among other things, on vouchers and media support. And Ed Greenspun comes to us from Canada, where you've also been involved in media policy for decades. So it's a really illustrious audience. And I know that there's so many questions that we're going to have about what is actually the state of play. There's new legislation that's been introduced in the United States. Canada unveiled a major package last year to help journalists. Julia can give us a little bit of a view of what's worked and what hasn't worked in Europe. So I'm hoping that we'll sort of cut to the solutions, which is something that you're all deeply involved with, and be really happy to take questions and have discussion. But Taylor will be the lead moderator and I'll only chime in as needed. So welcome to everybody and thank you.
Thanks, Anya, and yeah, welcome everybody. We have a great group of people participating in this too, beyond our panelists. So I think we'll move through a few opening questions and then open it up to this broader group, because I think we'll have a good conversation amongst these people. So my first inclination was to do a round of the table in terms of the harms that the decline of journalism presents and the debates around market failures. But I think what's actually particularly interesting about this moment right now is governments are stepping into the policy domain around journalism that they've been very reluctantly in many countries to do over the past decade. And this is leading to a period of real policy iteration and innovation amongst a group of like-minded countries. I think the way in which the Australia debate over the past month kind of exploded into the international attention signifies that here was a country stepping out into a domain, trying a new policy mechanism to engage with the media ecosystem, and that getting noticed internationally by other governments who are trying other sets of tools. So I would like to begin by each of you maybe reflecting a little bit on the state of the policy conversation in each of France, the US, and Canada, and just some opening remarks about what has been tried and how those policies are being viewed, both by the governments implementing them and by citizens in the country. So maybe, Julie, should we start with you on France? Because France is in many ways ahead of the curve here, I think. It's been engaging in policy in this domain much more assertively for much longer than some of the other countries.
Yes, so thanks a lot. So it's interesting to look how the state and government
something to the internet
subsidize the media
off the internet
a little bit everywhere in the world. But the thing is, I won't say that France is an exception. In a sense, if you look at Western democracies, the US are the exception. Because whether you consider France, you consider the UK, you consider Germany, Italy, you consider Nordic country, you consistently find public subsidies for the media that are going to vary from one country to the other between, let's say, €100 per capita to €200 per capita a year. And that is going to consist of two different things, and that vary from one country to the other, that's true, which is public funding of public TV and radio, and then public funding of private media. And in this case, in fact, private media is private newspapers and private news websites. You don't have any public funding for private TV and private radio. The system is far from being perfect in all these places, but we do know that some things work and some things do not. What works pretty well is the fact of having reduced VAT. So in France, VAT for newspapers and websites is 2.1%, while it should be 21%. In the UK, it's 0%. In fact, in the majority of the Western democracies in Europe, it's equal to 0%. And this is something that is an efficient way to subsidize the media, because this is something that is completely neutral with no government intervention at all. Then you have a number of issues linked to the fact that a number of subsidies are in fact completely, they come with some like decisions by institutions that are supposed to be independent, but that might be captured by the political power. And I think this is one of the reasons why in a country like the US for years, people were not really willing to introduce public subsidies. Even if from an historical point of view, we have to remember the fact that the US was the very first country in the world to publicly subsidize its media. And I think it began, if I remember well, in 1796. With reduced rate for the postal fees. So it has also existed in the US. It's just that it has changed a lot over time. But even in a country like France now, there are like a number of people thinking, and I'm pushing this idea very strongly, that we need to better rationalize the public funding for the media. And in particular, we need to be sure that we will have public funding for the media without any government intervention. And this is one of the reasons why with Anya, with Andrea Pratt, with Guy Rolnick, and some other people, who are like a little group of like 6 or 7 persons who have made this proposal of introducing media vouchers. And the idea of media vouchers is to have subsequent public funding for the media, but to give the opportunity to each citizen to allocate this voucher to the media of his choice. So this is really a way to make sure that there will be no government intervention in the allocation of public funding between different private media.
I want to talk about the vouchers issue in a moment, because Canada's tried something similar. So Ed might talk a bit about that as well, based largely on your work on it, interestingly. But my understanding is that France has also recently adopted the EU copyright designation from the Digital Single Market Directive, and is the only country in Europe to do that. Can you talk a little bit about the implications of that?
Yes, so what is complicated in this story is that we have this idea that we need to regulate at the European level. And I think it was pretty clever to regulate at the European level and not at the country level, because the idea is if there is a fight between Google, Facebook, and a single country, then the country is going to lose the fight. And in fact, it is what happened historically in Spain. It is what happened historically in Germany. But if we do it at the European level, we will have much more power collectively. But the thing is, there are different ways to do things in Europe. And for these copyright things, we have done a directive. What does it imply? So this is not a technical thing. It implies that once you have this European directive, it needs to be transcribed in all the laws of each European country. And each European country can, in fact, write the law its own way. So France was the very first European country to decide to put it into application. It began, in fact, a little bit more than 1 year ago, with a big fight with Google and Facebook. At the end of the day, the law is super unclear, and what happened is more that like a number of newspapers, and basically the syndicate of national daily and weekly newspapers have settled an agreement with Google and Facebook, but a lot of other media did not. And in a sense, we are. It's kind of. I think we are struggling for the same reasons than Australia is, given that all the media need money, and that we can understand the media. And given that they need money even more today because of the COVID crisis and the fact that the advertising market completely collapsed, you had, at the end of the day, this completely non-cooperative game in which the stronger media on the market, they were able to negotiate with Google and Facebook and obtain some money. Not enough for sure, not enough compared to all the studies that we had and that estimate the loss related to the competition from the GAFA. And so some big media outlets are going to receive a couple of million from Google and Facebook, and some others are completely excluded from this kind of agreements. And in a sense, you know, we are back to what was the situation in 2015 with the Google News initiative. And this was to be expected. The fact that really you let Google and Facebook alone in front of one country, like France, then at the end of the day, they don't want to give France any like positive privilege in terms of how much to pay the media, because they know that if they do that for France, then all over
There's so many different ways. I'm just trying to organize what I did for this data acquisition thing.
Could everybody
is this
please
okay?
mute?
Is this process map okay?
It's supposed to rain by midnight.
Sorry, everybody. If everybody could mute, that would be great. Thank you. Sorry, Julie.
Basically, I was done. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. So, Ed, I thought maybe we could turn to Canada now. In 2019, the Canadian government launched a series of legislative tools to address the journalism market in Canada. And I'm wondering if you could outline sort of what was done, what the reaction has been to that, and how that debate's evolving in Canada.
Yeah, thanks, Taylor. I lost service for a minute, so I didn't hear your entire introduction, but I did hear you say how governments have been changing a lot on this. And in Canada, certainly the first discussion I had was in February 2016. I got a call from somebody in the permanent public service, and I was still actually working in journalism. I was just about to move into the think tank sector, and he, you know, said, "Hey, we're apprehensive that in the term of this government, we're going to be called upon to give advice about the future journalism. We don't know anything about the future journalism. We don't want to know anything. We don't want to be seen to know anything. If it was shipbuilding or steel or music or film, would be okay, but la da 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 da." And it was clear they didn't. And it was kind of odd because Canada has been in the journalism policy business, you know, at least since the creation of the CBC, which was meant to be a bulwark and a protection against US radio stations coming into Canada originally. And then we took measures, tax measures in the 1960s and 70s that mean that you can, only Canadian-owned media can deduct advertising expenses for income tax purposes. If you're not Canadian-owned and Canadian-based, you can't do that. And there's a whole host of policies that have been in place for a long time. And there's a big fight in about 2000 about US magazines coming into Canada where they couldn't do this advertising thing, but they would do what was called split run magazines. They would basically take out 10% of the editorial and put in 10% Canadian editorial, and then consider themselves Canadianized in a form. So there was measures that were taken against that, including a WTO complaint from the United States against Canada. So when we started going down this road, there was a lot of history. And in 2019, there's people talk about it as 3 measures, but there were really 4 measures taken. The 4th measure is very close, I think, to what Steve has been doing in the States. So the 2 measures that I think in some ways are more minor is a 15% tax credit on circulation. The problem with the 15% tax credit on circulation up to $200 a year for your subscriptions is that A, it's probably 15% isn't enough to move the needle. And B, you know, all evidence in Canada shows, and this might relate to 15%, that I've seen this in other tax credits, that 96% of the people who get the tax credit were previously subscribing, and only 4% would be new. So you're not adding behavior in there. Second measure was to make journalism a qualified donee for philanthropic purposes, which it has not been in Canada, unlike the United States, and that's had some startup issues around it that we could discuss separately if we want. The third and I think most important measure was a labor tax credit, and something that we had been helped to design. If the problem was that we're having too few journalists and too little original news, then we felt the subsidization should go for hiring and employing journalists who will create original news. And so ultimately the government saw this off, but for qualified journalistic organizations, which is a whole, also a bit of a mess that we could talk about if you want, but 25% of the salary can come back in a tax credit up to a ceiling. And so, this has been a material amount of money. I know, one newspaper, that's collecting about $3 million a year off this, which I don't know what their editorial budget is, but I'm guessing that would be somewhere between 15 and 20% of their editorial budget is coming from this. So that's very material. And the fourth and final measure is a local journalism initiative in which the government is putting a certain amount of money in every year, and people apply, both news organizations and journalists. And so far in the first 2 years, it's employed 380 journalists, some of them part-time, some of them full-time, into, who wouldn't otherwise be working on a variety of news organizations in Canada, a variety of projects. So that's been a fairly successful program geared towards local.
Great, thank you. Steve, in many ways, the United States has been less enthusiastic about diving into the particularly federal policy space in this discussion, but that seems to be changing, in part due to some initiatives you're involved in. So if you could walk us through those, that would be great.
Yeah, you're right. U.S. policymakers have been quite reluctant to get involved in policymaking around local news, largely because the journalism sector itself is very reluctant. There has been no advocacy on the part of journalists to have government support. So it hasn't really been a topic of conversation until recently. And we are seeing active debates about this for the first time in years, or at least on a very serious level. And I think I group them into three buckets. One is cash grants. There are proposals out there for the federal government to provide grants to local news organizations through some system or other. Could be a formula, could be a government agency. There was an effort in the last budget bill or the last reconciliation bill to put a significant amount of money toward this with a fairly general mechanism for how to do it, but got quite far. Mm-hmm. So then secondly is this sort of the safe harbor legislation, the Sicilian-Klobuchar bill in the US, sort of allowing news organizations to get together and negotiate with the platforms, kind of a sibling of the Australia approach, but really more limited, at least for now, geared around, trying to get the platforms to better compensate for content. And then the third bucket is around, for now, tax credits of the sort that kind of mimic the voucher or the approach and that Julie was talking about, or the tax credit that Edward was talking about. And there's a variety of variations around tax ideas that are getting some conversation. The one that's gotten the most attention and support on the Hill actually is something called the Local Journalism Sustainability Act. It's an entirely tax-based proposal. It has three components. One is a tax credit to buy a newspaper subscription or donate to a nonprofit local news organization. 2 is the tax credit for hiring. So that's akin to what Edward was talking about in Canada. And 3 was a provision that maybe is sort of an interim thing pegged to COVID response, was a special tax credit for small businesses to advertise in local news, to use to advertise in local news. And I think that was even a refundable tax credit. The coalition that I lead, which is called the Rebuild Local News Coalition, has other ideas that we're promoting, but we like that the Local Journalism Sustainability Act, though I'm dying to hear more information about how things are working in Canada and France to know how we ought to amend it or fix it. I guess the other category, I think I would be stretching it if I said there was like a groundswell of support for this, but it's one where we're trying to create a groundswell of support, which is around public policy around replanting. Replanting meaning getting some of these newspapers that are owned by hedge funds or private equity funds, or even just large chains, to get broken off or replanted, acquired by nonprofit organizations or public benefit corporations in communities. And so there's tax policies that you could do that would incentivize both the seller and the buyer of replantings. So those I think are kind of the general lanes of policy. I mean, at this point, the one that's farthest is the Cicilline bill. I mean, none of them are particularly far, honestly, but the spending thing got surprisingly close in a very short window of time at the 11th hour. And it was kind of a wake-up call, I think, for folks in this space that like, wow, this, US policymakers are looking at local news in a very different way than they have in the past. And we need to get focused on this and really drive towards smart policy.
Thank you. I mean, I'd like to pick up on that distinction between policies addressing the media ecosystem generally and local news and specifically. And it feels to me that's maybe one of the tensions in this policy debate that makes it particularly difficult for governments, in that certain things you do to support journalism writ large might actually lead to greater market concentration and supporting potentially foreign-owned, for example, media organizations, rather than supporting a local ecosystem. So those policy tool sets might be actually in competition with one another and offsetting each other. Is that something that's being considered in this debate? Maybe we can start just to pick up on Steve in the US, and I'd love to hear, Judy, how that's happened in France too.
The energy, there's a lot of energy around focusing on local. I think the politics of that is better on both left and right. But the safe harbor legislation doesn't particularly focus on local. Yeah. So that's one of the pushbacks there. Now, there's a practical question of, even if you agree that it would be a best focusing of resources to focus on local, you then run into the definitional problems of how do you define local? What counts as a local news organization? And those are some difficult questions. As we were advocating for different things in the Hill in the last session, that was the number one question that came up. Not as a, you can't do that. I think the impulse was politically, if we can focus it on local, that's better. We should do that. Politically, there's more support for the local, weekly newspaper than there is for News Corp or New York Times or a national entity, but it's an open question whether it's possible.
Yeah. Julie, do you want to add in there on the French dynamic around this?
So in the French case, all the subsidies that have been introduced were with no difference between like national or local newspapers. Even if you could have some that indirectly benefit more to local newspapers. For example, what we call aide au portage. So this is a way to subsidize newspapers that are like brought directly to people, places, and this only local newspapers do that. But overall, if you look at who benefits the more from the existing subsidies, it really tends to be national newspapers. There have been some fight, but the fight was more to know whether we should change the rules so that to be sure that news website would benefit as much than paper, print media from the subsidies. This idea of like giving more money for local media than for national media as not being part of the French debate. This is a debate we had together with Anya and others for the vouchers proposal, whether we wanted to focus it on local journalism or not. You need to know that when we talk about that, when we talk about like US media, local media, they have had this tradition for like decades in the US to have newspapers at the city level. So it means that when the newspapers disappear, you have a news gap, you have like a news desert. There is no more local information. In fact, in France, we have never been so good with the local press. So the local press is more at the regional level with then some pages, editions that are going to change from like one city to the other. But it means that overall it's more stronger because the market is a little bit larger. So this idea of really like introducing some subsidies just for local news is not part of the French debate. I think it should be part of the debate overall. But it's kind of uneasy to decide that if we put a lot of money into these public subsidies, we want to focus this money on local journalism, because we also need national news. But yeah, it's kind of a big question. But even if I look at the Nordic country, for example, they have introduced some subsidies that are going to be specifically focused for like the number 2 newspapers to preserve pluralism, or with newspapers with like a smaller language, also to preserve a form of pluralism. But you don't have this idea that we should like subsidize local versus national news. One thing I really did like is what was done at some point was by the Washington Post, which was to offer a joint subscription. So you subscribe to the Washington Post, and then you will also have a subscription to a local newspaper. I think it's a nice way also to implement this kind of policies, so that you support in a sense both the national news and the local news.
Yeah, I think Julia and Taylor, you're all raising something really interesting, which is, I think, part of this opposition to Australia that we're hearing from so many of our colleagues is this feeling that it's only going to help Rupert Murdoch. And I guess one of the things I keep wondering is how we can sort of bridge the gap. Could you add a 2% surcharge and then give that out to smaller outlets? Obviously, in the US, where we don't have a mechanism set up, that would probably be very difficult. But in places where there is something like that, or there aren't endowments of funds, is there some way that we can bring these together? I feel that, to Julia's point, I feel the culture in the US is so much the startup culture, right? And this is what Google is trying to do as well with their news initiative. But I think it's so important that we actually fund or make sure the large outlets stay alive, because they're the ones that can do the really big and expensive investigations. They're the ones that can hire the lawyers, and we really need them. I think sometimes in the conversation, there's just too much glorification. I love the global muckrakers. I've done 2 books about them, but I agree that there has to be a way to kind of support both, I hope.
But Anya, just on this, like basically the thing that we made in our proposal on the vouchers to say that no media can receive more than 1% of all the vouchers that are allocated. And perhaps 1% is too much. It would be 0.5%. But it's a way to ensure that the allocation will favor competition, and a lot of different media outlets would benefit from it without imposing ex ante that this has only to benefit to like either local or national news.
That's why
Yeah,
the is so great.
to your
Sorry.
point, I'd say that in Canada, since you sent me a lovely note saying that you're excited because you think Canada has a solution, which it doesn't. But perhaps it's a little bit more advanced in experimenting, as I mentioned, particularly because of the many years of policy. So this debate around the Australia model is very live on the point that you say, the large legacy companies. We don't have a Rupert Murdoch. We have a chain that the government doesn't like. So maybe we have the opposite of Rupert Murdoch. But there's a concern that that local, which I actually think is a bit of an artificial creation. I started in a 3-person newsroom, and it was very local, I guess. But when you're a larger newsroom, you're still covering municipal governments, and you're doing acts of democracy in communities as well. The thing in Canada that we've had for many years is something called the Cable Fund. And the Cable Fund was really set up along the idea that distributors were creaming most of the profit out of the system and producers were not. So same kind of issue that in some ways we have today. And cable companies and satellite companies are required to pay 5% of their revenue into this fund, and then this fund is distributed to a variety of producers. I don't think it's distributed in a way that we would want to emulate, but nonetheless, it is collected, it's distributed. So there's a debate going on inside the Canadian government at the moment, whether they will follow an Australian model, a kind of bargaining model that I think has all kinds of weaknesses. Not the least of which I think it's put way too much power in the hands of the platforms, again, just in a different form, versus a checkoff levy type of model, and then those funds would be distributed.
Thank you. I want to go to a couple of questions that have come in from outside, from the group, but one other tension that really seems to exist in this debate is that, as Ed mentioned at the beginning, journalism isn't like other sectors in that one of its core mandates is to hold institutions accountable. And we seem to be heading into a moment where potentially half of editorial budgets of major news organizations are coming from a combination of state subsidy and platform support. It looks like that could be the result of the News Media Bargaining Code in the UK, where I've heard that upwards of 20% of the editorial budgets of some organizations might be supported via those content agreements. If you add the sort of 20 or 30% that some organizations are getting from government, we're just in this situation where journalism is both funded by and holding accountable the institutions that are supporting it. And I'm wondering what people think about what kinds of safeguards should be in place from the origins of these policy ideas, not retroactively, as is often the case, and how that should play out in our design of these conversations. I know, Steve, do you want to start how that's being thought about in the US? Because this is kind of central to the—
Yeah, well, it's frankly, that's the main reason why, journalists haven't advocated for this, is a deep pessimism that it's even possible, and and I think those of us who were on the fence got scared off the fence by the Trump administration, who, if there had been a pot of money to help local news organizations, sitting in the Commerce Department, it's not hard to imagine how that would have been used to punish and reward news organizations. So I think if you step back, and everyone agrees, everyone likes the postal subsidies of the 18th century, maybe because it's far away and so we can't really see the details of it. But if you ask, what are the key factors that made it successful? It was content neutral. It was subsidizing all sorts of scurrilous, attacks on the Federalists from the Jeffersonians and vice versa. It was based on a formula. Formula was actually, I think, based on distance. And that was it. And there was a certain amount of tolerance of sloppiness. It went to high quality newspapers, low quality newspapers. And there was a general acceptance of that messiness that some places that you would not view as, trustworthy or accurate were getting supported too, but it was for the greater good of propping up or standing up a newspaper industry, which it did. Yeah. And by the way, everything I just said, I got from Michael Schudson and reading all his work. He's in the audience, so I wanted to hat tip to him to that. But I think that the other avenue, the other stream in American policymaking around this is the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. That's more recent, the 1960s. It was created, and that has been so far just limited to public radio and public TV. They have been resistant to expanding their domain. They have not there have been proposals that said, hey, why don't we make that the Corporation for Nonprofit Media, for instance, subsidize nonprofit websites. The main opposition to doing that has been from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting itself, that doesn't want to change its mission. So I think the reason there is interest in the tax credit type approaches is it's sort of a spiritual cousin to the old postal subsidy, in that it's content neutral, it's formulaic, and it also borrows from the very popular charitable deduction law. In America, I mean, there's some direct subsidy to charities, but one of the most important is just the deduction you can take on giving charitable donations. If you think about it too hard, you probably get upset about how my tax dollars are helping subsidize your crazy charitable decisions, but we don't really think about it that way. We generally accept and like the idea that it's supporting the charitable sector in general. So I think that's why there's so much interest in the tax credit and learning about the voucher approach that Julie's talking about, or the tax credit approach that already has been experimented with in Canada.
Yeah, Taylor, if I could just add in there, I think the critical point here, because of the relationship between journalism and politics, and the necessary tension in that relationship, is that you want to have as little discretion in these programs as possible. You do want to have formulas, and you want to have, we've talked about it as the lightest and shortest touch possible. You can't exclude government from creating the rules of the game. That's impossible. But you don't want government, being involved in handing out, or even, quite frankly, on a continual basis, pointing the people who hand out money. So funds aren't a great idea, except perhaps at the margin, where you need to kind of help maybe startup media, things like that. But generally, this is why I like the labor tax credit, because it's once you qualify as a journalistic organization, which requires some criteria and some decision making, of course, once that happens, then you're in. If you employ journalists, you're in. There's some fine tuning that one might want to do there, but that'd be it. And I find in the Australia debate now, I guess if you really believe that the Australian government is going to be the main driver and it will be neutral, which are two assumptions that I don't think are necessarily so. If you actually believe that the platforms are going to exercise a level of control and discretion, even by withdrawing their services, as we have seen an instance of, then I find it kind of strange as a former newspaper editor who heard for many years how advertisers were influencing what we did. And it was true that advertisers from time to time, very, very rarely, but they did try to influence what we did. And basically the biggest advertiser maybe was worth 0.5% of your revenue. So they didn't have a lot of leverage on you in those instances. But as you say, if it's going to be 10 or 20% of your revenue, then you're renting your soul. And that's going to be very problematic for your coverage of the issues that we're talking about. Big problem.
On that influence question, Phil Howard, hi Phil, asked a question around the reaction of the platforms very publicly, clearly in the Australian case, which I think is demonstrative in all sorts of ways, but also behind the scenes in terms of lobbying in countries and actively engaging in this conversation behind the scenes. Julie, how has that played out in France with the platform reactions to the policies of the last couple of years?
So basically, if you look at what happens during the past years in France, what the platforms are trying to do is what I consider to be a form of lobbying, so that they set up funds to help the media. They give amounts that are not negligible. That can be like 1 million euros, 2 million euros, but that's clearly not enough compared to what they should pay if one considers how much money they make thanks to the newspapers. And thanks to all these funds that they set up, in a sense, they silence the media, which is a way to say it. And I really think that this is how it works. The Google News initiative, it appeared first in France in 2015, then it was extended 3 years ago at the European, 3 years later at the European level. At that point in 2015, media were pretty unhappy with Google and with Facebook, in particular with Google and with Google News. There were an attempt by the government to regulate the platforms, and then Google set up the Google Fund initiative, and everybody was pretty happy about it. Then they do it again at the European level, and they get kind of an agreement. Now they were a little bit more afraid with this European directive, and so they decided to settle like multilateral agreements with a number of key players in terms of media outlets. And I think this is what is like basically. I think what we should have in mind in this debate is, for sure, the platforms, they need to pay one way or the other. Okay, but they need to pay, but they need to pay a lot of things. They need to pay tax to begin with, in general, and they also need to pay for the news content they use. But I think the worst way for these platforms to pay is what they are doing today, setting fund. And Facebook is doing that to a larger extent than Google, even as of today, setting funds to which media outlets can apply. Because if they pay for the news this way, it really means that they kind of silence the media, because you need to apply to these funds. So what you don't want with the government, and with the government, you can try to be like more careful than with the platforms, because at least you can set up some rules to guarantee independence with respect to who is in power. Mm-hmm. With the platforms, you cannot do that. So I think this shouldn't work this way. The other thing, and I know that a lot of people do not agree with me, but if we think about public subsidies for the media, I think that these public subsidies shouldn't be tied to any tax on the platforms. Why do I say that? Because if we do that, so basically if we say that, okay, the public subsidies will be funded thanks to, 0.5% tax on the revenues of Facebook and Google, if we do that, we give the media outlets an incentive for the platforms to make more revenues. And in a sense, it means that, I don't know, if today, for example, you have the kind of proposals that were pushed by Elizabeth Warren to increase competition and to disentangle a little bit the platform, then the media outlets might wonder, but if we do that, we're going to decrease the revenues of the platforms, and it will be bad for us because it will have a negative effect on the fund. So I think we need to regulate better the platforms. We need to set up rules. For music, we know to do it pretty well. In France, for example, we have an institution in charge of that is called the SACEM, where some music is used on radio or in a movie everywhere. We know exactly who are the right holders, the length of the music that is used, and how to redistribute the money that need to be paid because of the copyright. We need know to do that for music. We have done that for like decades. So we could apply exactly the same rules for the media outlets, and from a technical point of view, it's something that is not so uneasy. And I'm from time to time, I'm a little bit surprised that this comparison between like music and news is not done from a technical point of view in terms of how the legislation should be implemented.
Right. There's a couple people on the call I want to pull into the conversation here. I mean, we have Olaf Steenvat, who's thought very closely about this distributive model and these mechanisms for how to get funding. and how to decide who should get funding. And I think the Journalism Trust Initiative actually has come up with, I think, the best model I've seen for this decision-making process. Olaf, do you want to jump in with a couple of comments about that and how you thought that through?
Yes, certainly. It's really good, by the way, to see you all. Lots of familiar faces around. And let me maybe start off with two pieces of good news. I think we all need good news these days. I think, first of all, when I hear the advertising-based business model of media is dead, maybe we should think twice. So what we hear from marketers, for example, is that to the tune of 50 billion per year in ad spend is lost due to ad fraud, due to mistargeting. And let's just imagine for a moment we can redirect only a fraction of this amount back to trustworthy journalism. This would definitely be not only good for media, but for everyone, because most of these amounts end up monetizing malicious actors, right? Yeah. So I think there is a ray of hope there. And the second piece of good news, I think, is when we speak about subsidizing or financing media these days in advocacy terms, I think it's not really difficult any longer to get this message across. And others said it before. I think across the political spectrum, I think the urgency and the importance of this message, and also really finding practical solutions is there. So I think that's not the problem. The challenge really lies in the technicalities, how to actually make it work in terms of legislation and maybe also data and IT. And this is, I think, what we've been working on with many others. And just to be quite brief on the JTI, I think what we believe are maybe three ingredients which are really important. The first one is criteria. And again, it has been mentioned earlier. What do we mean by journalism? What do we mean by local journalism? What do we mean by good journalism? And at the same time, avoid misuse of these definitions being turned into censorship. And, let's be clear, not all, environments work out in a way they do like in Canada, Norway, or Switzerland, I would say. So this is important to have this definition. I think what we currently see is that most governments, at least decent governments, refrain from making this call, quite rightly so. But then what? So in Australia, they, I think, assigned the regulator to come up with eligibility criteria for the news bargaining code. Good luck with that. I think what they did basically is ask the Association of Print Publishers, and they responded like they always do, by saying, this is not even a question, it's us. We are media, we are journalism, full stop. And this is what we are seeing playing out in Britain, where with the online harms bill on the last meters, they introduced a carve-out stipulation for news media, but forgot to define what they mean by news media. In Canada, Edward talked about it, we have these magnificent laws and funds, but without methodology, how to allocate. I mean, now they have, I think, sort of boards to make these decisions. But again, it all comes down to criteria. And we believe when it comes to journalistic content, it should be up to the journalistic community in a self-regulatory sense to basically not only come up with the criteria, but also to govern and to enforce them. Yeah. Very briefly, the second ingredient is technology to translate these criteria into signals which are machine readable and in real time to feed into algorithmic indexation, not only of search and social media, but also programmatic advertising. And then the third ingredient is a regulatory framework to actually create obligations for different stakeholders to make use of these elements. And last not least, I think the secret sauce here is compliance. Just to think always of mechanisms and instruments to check whether this goes beyond just non-binding declarations, but if all stakeholders, beginning with media outlets, but everybody else as well, lives up to to these self-assessments and promises.
Thank you, and I highly recommend people look at the JTI criteria. And what's most helpful for me is the shift from evaluating journalistic criteria via outcome switching it to institutional design and the criteria of the organizations. And to me, that just makes so much intuitive sense. And I think you've really pushed that forward. I can't go through a conversation with Michael Shudson in the audience without calling on him as well briefly here. Michael, I wonder what you think is different about this moment we're having around a policy conversation than previous times this has emerged and bubbled up to the surface of public debate.
I think what's different is that there is a policy discussion, at least for the U.S. I mean, when Leonard Downey and I wrote a report on the future of news, this was 2009, so it's not ancient times, but and we suggested we had a whole set of suggestions, but one of them suggested some federal funding for local news. And we got laughed out of the conversation. Journalists hated that idea, absolutely hated it. So going back to what Steve Waldman said earlier, they said, what have you been drinking, you guys? I mean, it was really amazing that it was just a non-starter. And so I surprised at some of these things that have gotten as far as they have, even in the U.S., although not all the way there. In the U.S., it seems to me it's going to be a long time still, but I'm encouraged by the private and nonprofit. I think it's sort of an explosion, and it probably and the other thing that is maybe leads one to be optimistic about governmental involvement in the U.S. is that everyone hates the platforms now, left, right, and center, and maybe something will come out of that. I'm not as skilled as the people on the panel and others in the room about thinking through what ways public policy might be engineered to make that happen.
Thank you. We're 5 minutes off the hour. I want to be conscious of everyone's time here. I'm wondering if we could just do one more round around the panel. Maybe just either as a closing reflections, what we've talked about, but or where you see briefly this debate going in each of these countries. Where are we going to be in a year or two in this conversation, particularly on the government policy levers conversation? Maybe we can go in reverse order as when we started. Steve, do you want to start?
Am I allowed to use my comment time to pose a question?
Sure.
I am, because of where this is headed, I'm really curious for Ed and Julia to, I guess, basically address this question. Based on what you've actually done in Canada, and Julia, based on the voucher proposal that you put together and what's happened with the policy so far, how could this tax credit, refundable tax credit proposal be changed to make it work? Like, if that's our piece of clay, some notion of a refundable tax credit, which is about as close as to a voucher as we've gotten so far. Based on what you've learned, could that approach be a pathway?
Steve, can I just ask Julia an addendum to your question? And perhaps, Julia, you answered this while I was offline, combating intermittent coverage here. But can you just tell us what it would cost, what the voucher system, what the cost of the voucher system would be? Because in Canada, I think there's a concern that it would be fiscally, that it would, kind of escalate fiscally in an unmanageable way.
Okay, so on the first point, in fact, you have had a fiscal package that was introduced in France last year, and that will be in place between 2021 and 2023, if I am not wrong, where you have a tax credit for subscription to newspapers. So this is kind of limited. It will be a tax credit up to 50 euros, I think, per household. I think it will be completely inefficient. And I'm going to explain you why. The first reason is that nobody knows about it, which is a big issue, I think, when you have this kind of rescue plan. They have informed the media, but they were unable to inform the citizens. And so the only people who are going to benefit from it are those people who are already subscribing to the media. So basically, it will be a complete fiscal loss for the government. It will be a gift to people who were already paying full cost and who were happy to continue paying full cost. The second reason why I don't really think it's an efficient model is that I do think that we need to support all kind of journalism when turning to the support. And it can be a website that is available for free. It can be a radio, like some podcast about local news. It can be a local TV channel. When we say like tax credit, you only support media that are not for free, and that are using de facto a paywall or a subscription model. And I think if you look today, for example, I have a lot of there is a lot of small websites in France that try to survive thanks to gift. They cannot put in place a paywall model because they're kind of too small, and they know that they won't work enough, but also they won't have enough impact to do it. But still, we want to fund them and we want to support them. And this is really where I am less convinced by this tax credit kind of model. Then for the vouchers, so in our proposal, you give all the citizens a voucher of a given amount. And the state gives a voucher. And the idea we go even further. We say that if the citizens do not allocate their voucher, given that we want enough money for the media, then the vouchers that are not allocated will be allocated according to the preferences of the citizens who express their preferences. So in fact, you know ex ante how much you want to spend. This is the reverse question. You decide how much you want to spend and you divide it by the number of households. In the proposal we push with Anya, we said $50. We need to know that $50 is super small in international comparison. My very first comment was to say that in a lot of countries, on average, we spend between 100 to 200 euros a year per adult overall to fund media, including public funding of TV and radio. What is $50? You can take the amount, and once you have the amount, divide it, and so that you are sure that while for the tax credit, it's more complicated because for the tax credit, you don't really know, and it can cost you much more than what you want at the end of the day. And the last thing with the tax credit, which the same thing, in fact, in France and in the US for different reasons, but we all know that this tax credit thing, from a fiscal point of view, they at the end of the day, they give more money to people who pay more tax, so to people with higher income than to people with low income. And it's kind of strange, I think, when we talk about the media and funding the media and funding news, to put in place a system where you are going to spend more money for the rich than you are going to do for the poor.
Thank you. Ed, do you want to close us out with what the U.S. can?
I'm happy to do it in 30 or 40 seconds. I think if I take your question about what we're going to see next year, I suspect that what we're going to see is that the Australian model, the flaws of the Australian model will be shown to be will be seen even more clearly, because at its base there's an asymmetry which which is going to shine through one way or another. It's going to shine through, and it's not an even bargain, even with baseball style arbitration. It's just not going to be, and we're going to have a better system than that. And in a Canadian context, I think the other thing that we're going to see, we've spent about 90 years trying to have a Canadian news system that is not subsumed under the colonialism of the United States media, the very powerful United States media, which comes into Canada so easily. And so we've built bulwarks without shutting that off. We've built, well, not bulwarks wouldn't be the right word, but we have built up Canadian media. And we now have a branch plant journalism that is much more pervasive. The New York Times has, I would guess, and this is based on more than just a guess, the New York Times has more subscribers in Canada than the Globe and Mail digital subscribers. In print, it was about 35-1 for the Globe and Mail over the New York Times. In digital, I think the New York Times is larger. They employ 3 or 4 journalists in Canada. That's great to have those 3 or 4 extra journalists, but that doesn't add to our civic structures and sinew. So I think we'll have to come to grips with those kinds of things.
Thank you. Anya, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, I really want to thank the panelists and the audience. This was even more interesting than I'd hoped. I think it's clear that the landscape has changed very quickly, and a lot of us are finding that our thinking is evolving very quickly. And so this is really a moment when we need to be learning from each other and learning from past experiences. And so I'm just really grateful to everybody who came and listened and contributed. There's, obviously so much more to do. So I'm really happy that Taylor and I have got 2 webinars already scheduled and probably several more in the offing. We're going to be looking at African perspectives on all of this on April 8th. And we've got Harry Dugmore, the head of the Nation Group in Kenya, and really talk about how, how can Harry's very interesting because he's living in Australia now, but he is South African. So we're going to be able to kind of look at the Australian law and other solutions for Africa. And then on April 15th, we've actually got 4 competition ministers coming. So we've got Rod Sims, and then we'll have the UK and the German competition ministers and the South African competition minister. So this will be really a chance to ask them, some of these hard questions and really kind of understand the law. A lot of you have contributed. We've got our book on media capture coming out in June. So I bet Taylor and I will probably talk about that as well at some point. So I think that we're going to keep having really interesting conversations. And I love that we were able to kind of get to nuts and bolts quite quickly rather than sort of the lamenting of our woes, because we've been doing that for years now. So I won't take more time, but I just want to thank everybody. We'll be putting everything on the SEPA YouTube channel, and hopefully will we put it on your center's channel as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, so that everybody, because there was so much to absorb, I think a lot of us will want to watch this again. So thank you all, and really great conversation. Thanks to everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Anya.
Great to see you all.
Thank you.